Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, January 4th, 2023. Now, this should be obvious, but living under the largest government in history is nothing remotely close to a constitutional government limited to few and defined delegated, enumerated powers. So on this episode, I'm talking about one of the primary ways they justify all that power in the monster state. That is the so-called interstate commerce clause. I'm going to start out with some foundational principles on delegated and reserved powers from people like James Madison, John Jay, and a couple of others. Then I've got a little bit about the current view, the current position on the Commerce Clause and how they're trying to expand it even further. And then a new study that was just published last month focusing on the original meaning of the phrase regulate commerce during the ratification debates 1787 to 1790 so we can understand how the people who understood the phrase regulate commerce understood it at the time that they gave the Constitution legal force when they ratified it. And I think that shows us that the current view is not just a crock, but that most of the federal administrative state, which is justified under that view, is also unconstitutional. But first of all, before getting to that, a quick hello and a huge thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one, I can't thank you enough. While we allow people another minute or so to get notifications to join us on the live stream platforms, of course, we're live streaming on YouTube and Facebook and Twitch and Twitter. We're also live streaming at Odyssey.com, and I hope we're streaming over at Rumble this morning as well, or this afternoon, depending where you are. But while we allow everyone to get notifications, a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. There's Haji in Southeast Michigan, Dixie Strong in Bama, Cheriton Farmer, Missouri, Tim Martin in Arizona, Alt Reality in Wisconsin, my original home. I know it's cold there these days. Mr. Greenbottle, 24, Clay Kent, Alan Hughes, Leslie G., good to see you in Southwest Missouri, that Liberty Gallon, DFW, Liberty Revolutionary, Lawrence Smith, and everyone else. I appreciate you being here. I should mention that if you want to follow along with the original source documents, the articles, the important research paper that I'm going to be citing, the addendum, there's all kinds of really good information on the Commerce Clause in this episode. You'll have to follow us over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Well, you don't absolutely have to, but I publish a blog post after the live stream is done, about 1 to 2 hours afterwards, and there you're going to find a show links section where I'm going to make it all very easy to find so you don't have to try to research and dig up stuff on whatever search platform you happen to use. That'll be over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And as I mentioned right at the outset, we're going to start out with some foundational principles about the nature of delegated and reserved powers under the Constitution. For that, let's begin with James Madison in Federalist Paper number 45, where he wrote that the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. Now, this was a novel approach, and Patrick Henry was concerned about this, but he basically had pointed out in the Virginia ratification debates, he said, look, every other government ever has always been the other way around. So the supporters of the Constitution kept repeating this. Like, no, we're creating something different. They're only authorized to do that stuff that's been enumerated in the Constitution. Expressly delegated is the phrase they often use. Madison goes on. So again, few and defined, delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government, reserved to the states, numerous and indefinite. The former will be exercised principally on external objects as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce, with which the last, the power of taxation, will, for the most part, be connected. The powers, Madison wrote, reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects which, in the ordinary course of affairs, concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people, and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. In other words, the federal government was going to be what many of them called them, a general government, just doing general basic stuff, delegated powers. There's, of course, the majority of those are in Article 1, Section 8, but depending on how you count them, there's only about 30 to 35 powers that have been delegated by the people of the several states to the federal government. Again, this was repeated over and over in different versions. Here's Charles Pinckney in a debate in South Carolina, January 1788. He said, "No powers could be executed or assumed," he's talking about the federal government, "but such as were expressly delegated." And even Alexander Hamilton, of all people, he got in on this. Of course, he flip-flopped. He'd make the case about limited delegated, expressly delegated powers, no implied powers before ratification. Then as soon as he needed those additional powers, he flipped the switch and changed his view. But here he is during the New York ratifying convention in June of 1788. He said, "Whatever is not expressly given to the federal head is reserved to the members." Or here's John Jay, also around that time, 1788. He said, "The Constitution only serves to point out that part of the people's business which they think proper by it to refer to the management of the persons therein designated." That's the first Chief Justice of the United States, also author of some of the Federalist Papers. He goes on, he said, "Those persons are to receive that business to manage, not for themselves as their own, but as agents and overseers for the people to whom they are constantly responsible and by whom only they are to be appointed." So the legal mind of John Jay, actually, this is it's pretty eloquent. But the short version, there's two main points there. One, the federal government is only authorized to exercise that stuff delegated to it in the Constitution and nothing more. And two, the people are the top of the food chain, and the government is only the agents of the people. So that's just some important foundational principles I wanted to start with. If the government had unlimited power, whether it was under necessary and proper or general welfare or today's subject, which is the Commerce Clause, the founding generation, the Federalist supporters of the Constitution, wouldn't be talking about how it had limited delegated powers. They would have just written the Commerce Clause. Do whatever the hell you want under this, and we don't have to worry about writing all this other stuff. Anyway, here from an article by Rob Natelson that we just published recently. Let me change some of these colors here. It's for those of you watching on video, I'm just doing a quick update. Anyways, he said, despite the Constitution's limits, the limits that I was just citing as explained by supporters of the Constitution, despite those limits, the feds have been acting as if they have a general police power. What Madison was talking about in Federalist 45 is what we can call the police power, the general, unlimited, undefined potential power of the people of the several states as the people of each state determine in their own state, for their own state, and no one else. And the government of the general government for these United States is supposed to be limited to few and defined powers. So the feds have been flipping it around. And of course, people, supporters of the monster state, all across the spectrum, they love it that way. They act totally the other way around, as if the federal government has that general police power. Rob writes, Congress has passed measures intruding into subjects as disconnected as land use, local tobacco sales, health care, and petty crime. All kinds of stuff are suddenly a federal issue. In addition, he writes, Congress has created a multitude of unelected administrative agencies that micromanage our lives without direct public accountability. And that's what John Jay was getting at. If they're agents of the people and they're accountable to the people, the idea of this, well, we'll call it the deep state, administrative state, whatever it may be, if they don't have accountability, this is not a government that is one where the people are at the top of the food chain. It's totally flipped on its head. Natelson goes on, he said, apologists for federal power justify most of this by referring to the Constitution's grant to Congress of authority, quote, to regulate commerce among the several states. And for the first, Rob points out, I guess about 150 years, maybe I would nitpick on that. The Commerce Clause itself, not the whole Constitution, because I make the case that the Constitution started going off the rails as soon as the first bank was passed in 1791. But anyways, the first 150 years or so, the Commerce Clause was basically understood to only give the federal government power over very certain specific economic activity, primarily trade. Commerce meant trade. And only when those activities crossed state lines. So it couldn't have been trade that might impact the trade in another state happening in one state and only in that one state. That's outside of federal purview. But over time, of course, that gets whittled away. And mostly on commerce, this happened during the New Deal era and our buddy Franklin FDR. And Rob writes, in his paper in 1937, Walton Hale Hamilton, great name for it, and Douglas Adair argued that the founders, they didn't understand commerce, regulating commerce as being about trade that crossed state lines primarily, but that would also include all economic relationships, including production as well as trade. So the production of something wasn't the commerce in something. That was preparing something, getting it ready for that trade, for that commerce. And then if that thing was just sold within the state, that couldn't be regulated either. None of it could. Robb writes that the effect of adopting this view is to authorize, well, actually what happened, though, is that during that New Deal era, the FDR-appointed court, the Supreme Court, just over and over, they rubber stamped this view. Instead of saying, oh, no, this is not how it's been, this is not how it's supposed to be, they just started supporting it, giving the federal government so much more power under the Commerce Clause. Then, Robb writes, the effect of adopting this view was to authorize, even without resort to the necessary and proper clause, congressional regulation of all economic transactions triggering interstate externalities, which for practical purposes means the entire American economy. So now, of course, that's not enough for these people. Having power over the entire American economy, flipping things completely on its head from how the founders understood it, that's definitely not enough. And currently, they're trying to expand it even further. Robb writes that two currently active scholars, you may know their names, Jack Balkin and Akhil Amar, go further. They contend that, as understood by the founders, commerce actually denoted human interactions of all forms, economic and non-economic. So they just flipped the meaning of a word, just like Hamilton did with the word necessary. Necessary didn't mean necessary to Hamilton when he wanted a bank. It meant convenient. And now commerce doesn't mean commerce. It doesn't mean trade. It means any human interaction, economic and non-economic. Now, they don't all hold that view, but this is the one that's being pushed. And anyways, under this view, Robb writes, the Constitution empowers Congress to regulate all social interchange, generating externalities across jurisdictional lines, subject only to the Constitution's itemized limits, such as the Bill of Rights. So basically, completely unlimited power. They don't even need a constitution at that point, as long as they just say, well, we can do whatever we want. We can regulate, ban, prohibit, control, whatever it may be, all human interaction. The Commerce Clause to them is the Constitution. But anyways, this is a total crock. A complete crock. But as long as enough people believe it, support it, love it, whatever it may be, turn a blind eye to it, things are going to keep getting worse. So in the last couple of decades, a couple of top scholars have done four comprehensive studies of the original legal meaning of the Commerce Clause. Nadelson writes, the first was published in 2001 by Professor Randy Barnett, who's done some awesome work on this over the years. It surveyed appearances of the word commerce in the constitutional debates of 1787 through 1790 and in other founding era sources. It found that the word commerce almost always meant mercantile trade. You can look at the context, see how they're using it, whether it's in debates, whether it's in essays, newspaper articles, etc., speeches, and they found that the word commerce always meant mercantile trade. Broader meanings were very rare. And in 2003, Barnett published a second survey which showed similar results. And then the following two surveys, one came in 2006, came from Rob Nadelson. He said, I published a third in 2006. Because the Constitution is a legal document, I examined how people employed the word commerce in English and American legal discourse. So he looked at the legal meaning of the word commerce. He said, my findings substantially agreed with those of Barnett. Commerce almost always meant trade. However, I also learned that the synonyms. Once in a while, I stumble on this stuff, but I do my best. Anyways, I also learned that the synonyms regulate commerce and regulate trade had a specialized meaning. So that's where he came to the most recent study, which is the meaning of the phrase regulate commerce to the ratifiers of the Constitution. That was published just last month, December 16th, 2022. And here, Nadelson focused his research just on that phrase, regulate commerce, regulation of commerce. And he used that study, he did that study in the constitutional debates of 1787, 1790, not in other contexts, other times is how he put it. He found about 60 uses of the phrase regulate commerce during the ratification debates, and you can see by the context of how they're using it what it means. He said the document set spans a wide spectrum of material. It encompasses legislative resolutions and debates, circular letters, personal correspondence, and records of the state ratifying conventions, not just partial transcripts previously available, because there is a lot more stuff that's been released in the last couple of decades, but also notes taken by individual participants. Included as well are newspaper columns and speeches by 7 framers of the Constitution. That's William Davie, North Carolina, Alexander Hamilton, Nathaniel Gorham, James Madison, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, Hugh Williamson, and Luther Martin. All of them are Federalists except for Luther Martin, but he also highlighted and researched through a bunch of anti-Federalist papers and speeches. He found references to regulate commerce by people like Federal Farmer, Agrippa, Candidus, Sentinel, a few others. And here's how Rob put it. There was no difference between how Federalists and Anti-Federalists define the term regulate commerce. And if you've watched my shows, if this isn't your first one, you've watched or listened to a bunch of my episodes, you know that I've covered a lot of the Anti-Federalist papers in a series. For example, Brutus and Cato. I'm going through Patrick Henry's speeches, because if we want to understand the original legal meaning of the Constitution, you don't just read the Federalist papers. The Federalist papers didn't have significant impact on the understanding of the Constitution because it was written primarily for the ratification debate for the people of New York, where it was likely to fail. So this was Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, at the urging of some others, working to convince the people of New York to vote in favor of ratification. So in order to understand the original legal meaning of what all the founders and ratifiers had to think of this when they gave the constitutional legal force, you have to understand the back and forth debate. So we do a lot of research into understanding what the Anti-Federalists had to say as well, not just the marketing materials put forward by the people in support. And Brutus, for example, he repeated them. This is where I'm going with this. Brutus basically was taking the position in some of his opposition to ratification was that, okay, I agree with how you're saying this is going to be or is supposed to be legally. For example, if he was debating back and forth with the great legal mind James Wilson, who was putting forth this same type of a viewpoint, like, okay, I can agree, this is exactly how it is in law, but we know that people with power will always try to manipulate things, and if you don't have very specifically defined things that are readily understood by average people, they're going to expand on that over time. Terms like general welfare, for example. That's just a quick side note. So anyways, Nadelson noted that, at least on the phrase regulate commerce, Federalists and Anti-Federalists had the same understanding of it in law. And in fact, he put together an addendum document, which I will link to in the show notes, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty, which gives all 60 uses of the phrase and the context and how you can find them, etc. It's, I don't know how many pages. 35 pages? Wow, okay. So it's got some highlights and quotes and all that stuff, and you've got people like Edmund Randolph and Patrick Henry and maybe Jefferson. A bunch of people are in there, so you can, I don't know if Jefferson's in this one. I've got him at the end. Anyway, so that's the entire document list. And the results, Rob writes, broadly confirm previous findings. When the framers and ratifiers used the phrase regulate commerce, they meant regulate trade. They did not mean all human interaction. Where's that point? I'm trying to find that quote where I had it in here. Yeah. They're saying Balkin and Amar, of course, are saying that regulate commerce means regulate all forms of human interaction, economic and non-economic. But really, the founders and ratifiers did, we know for a fact, over 20 years of research, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of source documents, speeches and papers, and way more than hundreds, thousands upon thousands of them, you can't find references to the phrase regulate commerce, meaning regulate all human activity. Both regulate commerce and regulate trade rights meant to administer the body of jurisprudence known as the law merchant. So this is a very specific body of law that was understood pretty well at the time of the founding. It governed trade, specifically trade, exchange of goods, but it also governed some conduct by merchants and other traders like navigation, commercial finance, bankruptcy, marine insurance, and a few other activities. But it didn't include, and therefore the Commerce Clause did not grant or delegate direct authority over other activities. Excluded from the Commerce Clause, for example, Rob writes, is most authority over land use, including agriculture and mining, manufacturing, land-based labor relations, insurance, healthcare, family law, and most crimes. So much of the federal administrative state is not authorized under the Commerce Clause as they claim it is today. He says, as a general proposition, this did not encompass non-economic activities, nor even most economic activities. People think just because there's economic or there's money happening or its potential for economic increase, that automatically it's under the Commerce Clause. But no. Of course, we have to remember that it also has to go across state lines, and it has to primarily be trade, not the manufacture or production of stuff that will be used in trade or bartered or traded in commercial activity or economic activity. This included land use, real estate transactions, inheritance, production of most kinds were almost all excluded. Here's how Thomas Jefferson put it a few years later in a letter to Albert Gallatin. This is October 13, 1802. He said, "The power to regulate commerce does not give a power to build piers, wharfs, open ports, clear the bed of rivers, dig canals, build warehouses, build manufacturing machines, set up manufactories, cultivate the earth." So that's Jefferson's view of it some years later, explaining what we knew that the founders and ratifiers understood so many years earlier during ratification. Anyways, this is the kind of essential foundational information that we work hard every single day to get out to more and more people. We have to first understand what the actual limits of the Constitution are supposed to be, and then we are supposed to figure out how to keep the government in check, even when the government refuses to do what it's supposed to do, which is follow the Constitution, and they never, ever do what they're supposed to. So this is the type of work we're doing. It's a 1-2 punch. Some of it is education about the original legal meaning of the Constitution, like this episode today, and some of it is strategic, how to actually stop them from violating, which is, if you watched Monday's episode on some new ATF regulations, it's got a lot of that as well. So as Samuel Adams put it in 1771, all might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought. So we do this kind of work all the time, and nothing helps us get this job done more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month. We also have annual and lifetime options, 5-year, etc. Find all that information over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Anyways, let me take a look over in the live chat and see if there's any comments or questions I can get back to. Some depth, some long comments that I can't read through. Someone says, smash the like. There are no solutions, says R.C. Andrews, only trade-offs. I think it's really important to understand that there's definitely no silver bullet. Most people seem to try to sell you on just do this one thing, support this one organization, support this one amendment, this one law, this one candidate, whatever it may be, and all of our problems are going to be moving in the wrong direction, and we're going to be moving towards liberty. And this is absurd. It is going to take probably, if we're talking about things going off the rails starting back in 1791, we have got generations and generations of people who have failed to do their duty, as John Dickinson told us, that keeping the government within the bounds of the Constitution is up to the supreme sovereignty of the people. He said it is their duty to watch and their right to take care that the Constitution be preserved. The people have not done that. So we've got a lot of work to do to educate people on the values of freedom, the limits of government under the Constitution, and what needs to be done to keep it in check. Juliet asks, what about the sovereign movement? I'm not familiar with that. Any truth to these theories in your opinion? I'm not familiar with that at all. If you want to send something over, it's team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Juliet or anyone else, if you've got questions or comments or ideas for future episodes, I get a ton of great ones in the comments. I read through them throughout the week, off and on. Here, I always have a daily task. Check through comments to make sure that I always set aside some time to read through them, and I appreciate a lot of the feedback. A lot of people leave comments just to help trigger the algorithms, which is great on some of the mainstream platforms, but I get tons of great ideas from questions like that, or even people who are challenging me like, oh, dude, what you said here was absolutely wrong. Sometimes I've been able to correct myself. I know I did a follow-up episode once on Thomas Paine where someone pointed out some bad stuff that I said, or not really bad stuff. I just made some errors. So I really appreciate the interactivity with all of you guys here. And also email me at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Hi over to Kirk Morrison as well. Traveler says traveling is right. There's so many things that are a right, but we don't want to rely on government to protect those rights. I know a lot of people think that that's how things are supposed to be, but really when you're living under the largest government, the largest empire in history, one that says regulating commerce, trade across state lines really means regulating all human activity, pretty much, economic and non-economic, these people aren't to be trusted. And even if they do the right thing for something that you like today, you also have to recognize that other people who absolutely can't stand you will have the same power in the future to do the opposite. So it really is up to the people to learn how to exercise their rights, whether the government wants us to or not. Anyways, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. A lot of it is pretty deep. I didn't go into a lot of the depth of this, the paper and the research that I'm covering here today, but I will link to all that in the show notes in case you've got a lot more interest in that. It's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I appreciate you spending some time with me today, and I'll see you next time here on the path to liberty.